Vampire Hunter D, Dark Nocturne, written by Hideyuki Kikuchi, illustrations by Yoshitaka Amano. Dark Nocturne. Serendipity in the Black Forest. Chapter 1, First Part. Less than 5 minutes after thunder began to rumble in the western sky, white streaks fell, noisily battering the leaves all around the traveler. Having surmised that this might happen from the look of the sky at dusk, Rai wasn't overly concerned, but rather clucked his tongue at fate. Although it was probably no more than an evening shower, he still had to do something. It was actually to his good fortune that woods lay like black haze to either side of the narrow road. Before diving in, he'd listened intently, and the thunder had died out. At least he wouldn't have to worry about being struck by lightning. Once he was within the tunnel formed by the interwoven branches, the fusillade of raindrops ceased as if it no longer existed. The forest was renowned as one of the largest and most thickly wooded in the area. It took less than 5 minutes for the blue sky to be replaced by jet black. Getting through the woods would take an hour at the very least, and after that would be an additional hour's walk to the village of Venice. "Guess I'll be camping," Rai said with resignation. This wasn't a safe place, though. The forest spirits could breathe out a greenish cloud that put travelers to sleep so the monsters could steal their still-beating hearts, and werewolves, gold eyes, and tree-dwellers were undoubtedly watching Rai from somewhere. A cursory glance at the tree trunks around him would have revealed the marks left by their fangs and claws. However, now that he'd settled on this course of action, Rai quickly went to work. Taking a sleeping bag and pneumatic gun from the duffel bag on his back, he then put owl eyes into his own eyes. A pair of thin membranes that almost completely covered his eyeballs. They served as infrared filters, allowing him to discern his surroundings even in pitch blackness. In situations where building a campfire might prove deadly, travelers found such lenses indispensable. Though the young man had intended to eat some jerky before climbing into his sleeping bag, his eyelids were suddenly on the brink of collapsing. After pressing on with a scant 3 hours of sleep per night over the last 4 or 5 days, it seemed he was finally paying the price. Checking that his gun was loaded and pressurized, he just leaped into his sleeping bag when the Sandman claimed him. Still, he had remembered to at least switch on the security system connected to his sleeping bag. No sooner had his eyes closed than the buzzer went off. Rai quickly grabbed the timepiece he wore around his neck and pulled it up for closer inspection. More than 6 hours had passed since he dropped off to sleep. The grass was whistling, and the sound was accompanied by movement. Movement from all around Rai, and somewhere off deeper in the forest. A chill ran down his spine as he watched. Something was moving through the grass. The lines and number of creatures cut through the verdure were almost elegant. Then his terror faded, and even his surprise melted away softly. A faint song trembled in the air. The voice was soft and sweet. However, it issued from the throat of a man. That song, Rai thought while leaping from his sleeping bag. As he walked off with only his pneumatic gun in hand, there wasn't the least bit of uncertainty in his steps. That song, he thought, those lyrics, that melody. While these thoughts alone swirled in his brain, a red spider came to rest on his shoulder. Something slimy wrapped around his ankle. He didn't even seem to mind. The face of his father appeared to him. He looked weak from his suffering, and he was reaching out from his bed with one hand. Rai thought he was going to tell him something. Though his father had always been a man of few words, and he never preached at his son. Surely he'd have at least one thought he'd like to leave the boy. But Rai soon realized he was mistaken. He saw himself reflected in his father's eyes. However, it was not him that his father saw. His dry lips trembled. His mouth yawned like a cavern, and what came from him made Rai forget all about his father's imminent demise. There wasn't much he could remember of the lonely funeral service, or the eulogy in which the village mayor had praised the old man as a splendid cobbler. His ears still rang with that song, and the one thing he'd said, in the village of Anise. And then his father had shut his mouth and his eyes, and that was all. The day after the funeral, Rai had set out on a journey to Anise. The 17-year-old never questioned the notion that the song and the final words the old man had left to this world were inseparably linked. As he walked, he heard the sound of rain above him. Strangely enough, only his sense of time remained. A little more than 5 minutes had passed since he'd started walking, and the singing had long since faded. And yet his body moved naturally, and with clear conviction. Far off to his left he heard a horse whinny. Not halting, Rai turned his face alone. He could see through the dark of night. The horse and its rider seemed to be swathed in a color deeper than the darkness. He couldn't make out the rider's face, but he wore a long coat or a cape of some kind. Ordinarily, he would have called out to the stranger immediately, just to have some human companionship. But now, the thought didn't even occur to him. Facing forward again, Rai kept walking. The rider behind him remained silent as well. After going another 5 or 6 paces, the young man became somewhat curious and turned. He didn't know exactly why he did so. The figure had been swallowed by the darkness. Rai got the feeling that if he were to call out, he'd receive no answer, and would be devoured as well. I must be seeing things, he thought instantly. Only after he'd gone another 10 paces did he finally see the flames. By the capering orange flare some 30 feet ahead of him, several figures were moving around. 3 of them. Instinctively, Rai hid himself behind a colossal tree. Something terribly ominous seemed to be gusting at him. One of the figures sat before the fire, while the other 2 stood a short distance away, surveying the area. Their faces were slightly downturned. They seemed to be scrutinizing the ground. Although Rai couldn't make out the face of the seated man, the other 2 both sported beards. One of them wore the jacket and pants of a khaki-colored uniform of some sort, while his companion was covered from the neck down by some sort of protective metal armor. Each wore a longsword on his hip. Crouching down, the one in armor snatched something from the grass in a movement that was swifter than the eye could follow. Seeing the long black shape wriggling as the man grasped it with his right hand, Rai was horrified. I got one too, said the armored man. Hell, I've got 3 already, said the one in khaki, sticking out his left hand. A trio of similar creatures thrashed in his fist. Surely that must have been what slipped so noisily through the grass. Judging by the color and size of them, they were undoubtedly wood snakes. "Good eating tonight," the one in armor said, first holding out the creature, and then suddenly flinging it into the air. His right hand became a blur. While the wood snake fell as a single animal, as soon as the flames touched it, it split into 3 pieces that vanished into the glowing blaze. "Don't forget these," said the uniformed one, effortlessly doing the same to several more serpents before he turned to the man who was seated. The flames gave off a bluish smoke. "It sure is something, I'll give you that," the one in uniform remarked. "When they hear that song of ours, everything from the little rock eaters to mountain snakes comes right over to us. With service like that, we'll never go hungry." "Sure as blazes is a funny song," the other one said, shoving his right hand into the fire. He continued, "Oh, they're cooking up real nice. Hot, though. You know, no matter how we try to imitate you, we can't sing a bar. Strange, ain't it? Wish I could have heard the real deal, too." Rye thought his heart might stop. By the real deal, could he mean the same song his father had heard? Who'd sung it, and where? Had one of these men actually listened to it, just like his father? And where they were headed, someplace special? Rye turned his gaze on the last of the 3. His heart began to beat loudly enough to reverberate within his own skull. The flame seemed to add to his beauty. His age couldn't have differed much from Rye's own. The glow from the fire made it impossible to tell the color of his complexion, but he had golden hair. His closed eyes, his lips, the line of his nose. He was so handsome that anyone who dared to declare him as anything short of beautiful was likely to have their hearts stop cold from mortification. The other 2 didn't look like they belonged with him at all. Feeling a little angry, Rye thought there must be some sort of mistake. Just then, the gorgeous young man turned to him and said, "Hey, you. Come over here." Rye stiffened with a shock. Apparently even the rougher-looking pair had noticed him, and they were daunting smiles as they called to him, "Yeah, come on out. Have a bite with us." Patriarch indicated by a small cross. Second part. Not surprisingly, Rye hesitated. There was something dangerous about this trio. "You know, you ain't the first person that song's dragged over," said the one in uniform. "Everyone from old men and women right down to babies just come right on out for the sound of it. It's a weird song. Come here and have a drink with us. We got us some mighty fine hooch." Rye came to a decision. This was no time to stay in hiding. When he stepped out with his pneumatic gun pointed toward the ground, the grins of the bearded bruisers grew even deeper. "Well, ain't you a looker? You're liable to have the she-devils chasing after you." "Yes, sir. Real men were made for traveling. Well, come on over already. It ain't like we're gonna eat you." "Before I do, could I ask you something?" said Rye. His voice was a lot steadier than he thought it'd be. "And what would that be?" the lovely young man asked, his eyes still shut. "Where are you guys headed?" "Have we got no destination at all?" the man in uniform said, shrugging his shoulders before he hunched over. Quickly sticking his hand into the fire, he pulled out a chunk of wood snake. He brought the smoking meat up to his mouth, but it stopped right before his lips. Rye got the feeling there'd been some old, odd change by the look in the eyes of the 2 men as they stared at him. Now this one looks tasty, the uniformed man said, throwing the chunk of flesh he held down at his feet. His hand came up smoothly, and he beckoned with it, saying, "Come to Daddy." Rye saw that his eyes gave off an unsettling red light. "I've got to get out of here," he cried to himself in his head. "This is just too dangerous. I need to leave and fast." However, his feet were stuck to the ground. His arms wouldn't move either. It was as if lead had been injected into his veins. "Come on now," said the man in uniform, beckoning once more. Behind the boy something moved. Passing over his head, it slid down right in front of his face. What Rye saw was a trunk about as thick as a man could reach around, and it glittered a bluish green as it reflected the flames. It couldn't be. This couldn't be what he'd hidden behind after mistaking it for a tree trunk. "Come to me," the uniformed man said again, and then his mouth mysteriously stretched to either side. It split from ear to ear, as the saying goes. Only in his case, it went even further, opening all the way around except for about an inch at the back of his neck. The gigantic wood snake Rye had mistaken for a tree flicked the little red tongue from its mouth. It could probably swallow the man in the uniform whole, and this thought had the young traveler completely paralyzed. With a hiss, the tongue stretched out a good 3 feet to strike the face of the uniformed man. Just then the strangest thing occurred. The man's head from the mouth up, or to be more precise, from his upper lip, flipped backward sharply. The hinge connecting the two portions was a narrow section of skin at the back of his head less than an inch wide. Beyond rows of teeth in his disturbingly large jaws, there was no tongue or tonsils or anything, only a cavernous opening as wide as his neck, and the wood snake's head was swallowed by it. The serpent's head was 3 times as wide as the throat of the uniformed man, but it effortlessly slid into the opening. Naturally, his neck swelled tremendously. It wouldn't have been all surprising if it had split wide open. Rye stared in amazement at the man's belly, now swollen like a keg of beer. Illusion, sorcery, or reality? While the young man was still trying to decide what to make of this, the snake kept being sucked into the man's outlandish mouth until only the tapered end of its tail remained, and even that promptly vanished. At the same time, the half of his head that had gone backward flipped forward again, coming down on his jaw like the lid of a jar. From below his ear came the sound of bones snapping back together, and then the astounding man gave a slap to his great drum of a belly and let out a resounding belch. That alone would have been enough to give anyone goosebumps, but then ripples quickly spread across the surface of his stomach. "You really do pack it away," the armored man said with something like admiration. Rubbing his stomach lovingly, the man in uniform replied, "Hell, one this big is bound to come in handy sometime. Only fight with the others. Not to worry, I'm always careful to keep them in separate compartments." The man's laughter sounded like something out of a nightmare to Rye. Before it ended, the young man with blonde hair said, "You asked a strange question just now, didn't you?" His voice and his manner of speaking were those of someone's Rye's age, and yet his tone also seemed to be invested with something horribly cold and mature. "The very first thing you asked wasn't our names or what we did," he continued, "but rather our destination. Why is that?" "No reason," Rye said, his eyes off the boy's gorgeous countenance. If he were to gaze at it for too long, it seemed like his mind would melt into a milky haze, and he'd completely lose himself. I was just curious, he added. About what? Our destination, or about that song? The young man said, slowly getting to his feet. Apparently there must have been some special meaning attached to that action, because his two far rougher-looking companions backed away with paled countenances. That's a song you can't forget once you've heard it. Those under its spell always want to find the singer. I heard it when I was young, in my mother's womb, or so I've been told. When and where did you hear it? Bride was just about to reply that he didn't know anything about any song, but then he suddenly became aware that an intense urge to defy the handsome young man before him had been building in his gut. I heard it with my own ears when I was 2, said Rye. In the village of Anise. There was silence. A silence far more terrifying than any other change could have been. Is that right? I guess that figures, said the blond man. As much as I liked the song, I don't intend to go looking for the singer to hear it again. It'll all be best if we parted company with you here. Rye finally noticed that the young man still had his eyes shut. I was just thinking the same thing myself. See you around. And with that casual expression, Rye turned his back on them. From the base of his neck to his waist was horrendously cold. The chill concentrated in the left side of his chest. It hurt. His feet moved smoothly, but the pain grew worse and worse. At the last second he thought, here it comes. That's when it happened. Off to his right, he heard a hoarse whinny. The pain and the chill vanished abruptly. Rye didn't turn around. He wanted to leave as quickly as possible. The sound of the rain had died out. When he finally reached someplace that seemed safe, Rye had a strong suspicion he'd been saved by the rider he saw earlier. Second part and third part. Located in an eastern frontier sector, the village of Anise was bordered on all sides by rugged mountain ranges and black forests. The amount of land cultivated was barely enough to provide for the 1,000 villagers who lived there, but the inhabitants supplemented their income by using the waters of the Garnow River that ran along the western edge of the village to transport lumber, an activity that helped make them one of the wealthier communities in the area. The weather controllers had almost no effect on this region, so the 4 seasons came and went like a deity robed in 4 distinct, if simplistic, ensembles. Summer was a deep green veil that covered everything beneath the blue sky. Fall was a coat of apples and plums that swayed with sorrow-laden breasts. Winter was a white gown that hid even the school's highest spire. And now it was spring, the season when remnants of snow that feared the warmth flowed away in the clear streams. Grass and flowers put forth buds, and children's feet could be heard slapping their way up and down the muddy streets. Many people came to the village, merchants and fortune-tellers, traveling artisans and gamblers, con men and bodyguards, drifters and criminals, and yet, up until last spring it had always been peaceful. But this year, it didn't look like that was going to be the case. There'd been so many travelers that day. Some were just passing through, while others had various aims, and would stay a while. The peaceful village accepted them all without complaint, even though there was some of the community would have done well to reject. There were 2 places to stay in the village. One was a lodging house for merchants where everyone slept packed into the same room like sardines. The other was a hotel with private rooms. Rye chose the hotel. Having camped out all the way to Anise, He still had money to spare, and he also suspected the trio might check into the Merchant Inn. He somewhat regretted ever having mentioned the village of Aeneas to them. While the accommodations were hardly what anyone would call spectacular, the room was at least clean. It was also unpretentiously strung with high-voltage lines and various charms to ward off evil spirits and smaller monstrosities. Just as he was unpacking his baggage and considering what he should do next, a steady knock rang out and the door to his room was opened before he could even reply. "Oh, I'm terribly sorry," said the girl. The room seemed to brighten immediately thanks to her fearless tone and bearing. She must have been related to the sulky old man who'd showed Rye to his room, as her carefree demeanor didn't fit that of a mere employee. "I'm Amni. I work here at the hotel. I just came by to drop off something you forgot." "Well, actually, it's because I heard there was someone about my age staying here, and I wanted to have a peek at you. Mind if I come in?" Once again, she didn't bother to wait for an answer, but rather strutted right in. Over her blue blouse, she wore a dowdy employee jumpsuit, but like a doe, she also had an almost impudent vigor that was violently at odds with her attire. "And just what did I forget?" Rye asked, a bit perplexed. It wasn't as if he hadn't had any experience with girls back in his home village. To the contrary, his lithe build and sensitive nature made him quite popular compared to all the rough and tough country boys there. Still, none of the girls he'd known had been quite so forward. "These. Put them in if you're going to be outside at night." A pale hand opened before the boy's chest. Taking the two little rubber items from her, Rye stared down at them. "Earplugs," he said. "That's right. So don't go sticking them up your nose by mistake." "Why, something wrong?" "No, it's nothing. Why do I need these things?" "I don't rightly know," the girl replied. "It's just a custom. We all use them when we're out walking at night, too." Huh. As he intently scrutinized the little rubber plugs, Rye wondered if he should ask Amna about the song. In a sense, it was taboo for a common traveler to ask about the history or traditions of the villages he visited. Quite naturally, in cases where the area had been under the direct control of the nobility, and their servants and the villagers had been terrorized day and night, they were loath to revisit their fearful past to the point of fanaticism. "Yes," said Amne. "When night came, they'd slip out of the place where they were held and begin to prowl the village streets, with their hands stuck in their pockets, like this, kind of slouched forward, while they sang a certain song." "What kind of song was it?" "I don't know. All of this happened fairly far back, more than 200 years ago, and the nobility suddenly vanished about that time. But even now, rumors still remain that they're actually hiding out somewhere and are going to swoop back down on us." "You mean to tell me no one wrote the song down?" Rye asked. "Who'd ever do such a thing? You think we'd bother committing to paper every rotten thing the nobility ever did to us? But now that you mention it, I heard that when rumors were going around a while back that they had come back, a traveling composer went into the mansion and jotted down the tune. I bet it's another bullshit story." Given that she was working in the service industry, the girl's use of profanity with a customer probably crossed the line, but Rye didn't seem to notice. "That talk about them coming back, how long ago was that?" "Let me see. It'd have to be nearly 20 years, I suppose." In addition to the wandering composer, his father must have heard the song as well. "Is there anyone who can recite the song?" asked the young man. "Not a soul. A long time ago, you used to be able to hear it anywhere you went in these parts, because all the men and women who heard it went up to the mansion, and after they came back, the villagers who hadn't been affected had no choice but to listen to them sing. However, they say it simply can't be duplicated. The tune itself is simple yet beautiful, but you can't even hum the first few couple of bars. The only people who can sing it are the ones who've heard it themselves at the mansion. And I suppose by the same token, no one could jot it down either. Perhaps as a result of not inhaling for so long, Emne stopped there and took a few breaths. "Are you sure it's okay to tell me things like this?" Rai said, smiling wryly all the while. "Sure it is. When I'm at school, no one there listens to the results of my research." "Your research? You mean to tell me that was the theory you came up with?" "That's right. Why, I'm even in the Historical Research Society at school." "Seems like you're kind of interested, too. So what are you here for, anyway?" "I came here to hear a song, actually." "You're pulling my leg," the girl said, but she looked rather pleased. She must have figured he'd enjoyed her theory. "Well, not that it matters, Emne continued. "It's past noon, so you should probably head out and get yourself some lunch. After that, I'll show you around the village." "That'd be a big help, but you really don't have to. You've got a lot to do here at the hotel, don't you?" "Not a problem," the girl replied. "At the moment, you're the only guest we've got, and the saloon downstairs doesn't get crowded until sundown. So where would you like to go?" In his heart, Rai now faced a dilemma. He couldn't very well tell her he'd come up to hear the noble song or to meet the singer. But now that he knew a noble was involved, his interest hadn't waned in the least. To the contrary, the knowledge had only fanned the flames of his tenacity all the more. "Well, that's a good question. That mansion's probably pretty far off, right?" he said with a calculated disinterest. The answer came instantaneously. "Hey, it's no problem. It's 30 minutes by wagon. After you have lunch, we'll still have time for a nice leisurely round trip. We've even got a wagon we're not using right now. Now run along to the dining. Go ahead and take on the street," and going straight for about 2 minutes, he found the sign for the diner. Right above it, the words liquor and dry goods were written in large letters. In small towns and villages, it was typical to combine the general store, diner, and saloon into a single establishment. Although Rai thought they might be in there, he wound up being the only customer. Finishing his meal of stew and bread, Rai followed the street west. The fence at the edge of the village was where he was supposed to meet Omne. Snow still remained in a few spots along the road. Stepping into an alley he'd been told was a shortcut, Rai stopped in his tracks. Countless gold sparkles drifted in the air, seeds of the golden snowflowers dancing on a gentle breeze. They weren't an uncommon sight in the eastern frontier sectors. Exceptionally heat and cold resistant, the seeds could also withstand poor soil conditions and severe weather until one bright sunny day in spring, when they bloomed into small golden flowers that delighted people's eyes. Bathed from head to toe in their golden light, and seeming to almost suck up the glow, the figure in black suddenly stood there on muddy earth, not yet dry from the previous night's rain. He wore a wide-brimmed traveler's hat and a long coat, and had an elegant longsword across his back. That was all the young man could see of him from behind. A short distance from him, a saddled horse was toppled by the side of the road. Rai didn't move. There was something about the figure that was even more dangerous than the trio he'd encountered the previous night. Suddenly, it occurred to him that the rider who'd saved him in the forest might be this very same man. The spring breeze stroked the end of his nose, as if that harmless sign was a declaration of war, and the figure in black made a leap. Looking like darkness coalesced, the figure sent flecks of light flying everywhere. The roof of the warehouse off to his right was 10 feet high. At the top of it, Rye saw a silvery flash. There were two simultaneous thuds, and a brief cry of pain rang out. Rye then watched something red fly off at an angle and strike the ground. "We'll meet again," a voice he'd heard before shouted in apparent pain from somewhere in the heavens. Rye ran out into the middle of the road. The spell over him had broken. As he was looking up, the figure in black landed right in front of him without a sound. The young traveler was once more thrown into a hopeless daze. Could a human face possibly be this beautiful? He had to wonder if he weren't perhaps still in the forest, and all of this was a dream. "It looks like you made it out okay," said the man. Although that was hardly what someone fresh from a deadly conflict would be expected to say, Rye seemed free from such concerns as he nodded. "Thanks for what you did last night," he said with bowed head. "That character just now, was he one of them?" "Apparently they hold a grudge. You'd do well to watch yourself." "I will," the young man said, adding, I'm Rye. Call me D," said the youth in black, brilliant bits of gold dancing all around him. Chapter 1 end. The White Song of the Ruined Man's, Chapter 2, First Part. Just then, the squeak of wheels came from the far end of the street. "Sorry to keep you waiting," Amne said from the driver's seat of the wagon, as she pulled up beside the two of them, and then let her eyes went wide. Her whole body, not just her cheeks, seemed to blush like a rose. "Who's he?" the girl asked in a tone that could only be described as childlike. "This is Mr. D. He happened to help me out last night." "You don't say. Where are you going?" D asked bluntly. "There's one of the nobility's mansions up ahead. Aside from that, there's nothing to see around here," Rye said, his tone growing more familiar. "In that case, give me a lift." "Huh?" Rye said, raising his eyebrow. Anxiety had suddenly taken root in him. Although he frantically sought a reason for this, his mind encountered only an amorphous darkness. "Be my guest," said Amne, gesturing to the seat beside her own, somewhat absent-mindedly. Not only had she readily agreed, but she seemed to be in a trance. To a girl of 17, Dee's beauty must have been a drug. "That's your seat," Dee said, tapping the boy on the shoulder. "But I thought," as he pushed Rye into the seat next to hers before he could say another word, Amna showed her teeth. She was a straightforward girl. Once Dee had climbed into the cargo bed and back, and the vehicle's unseemly trio of pistons began pumping up and down, the wagon started splashing through the mud puddles at a relaxed pace. When Amne faced forward again, she let out a shriek and pointed at the ground. "That thing over there. It's a hand," she exclaimed. Although the black earth didn't make it too obvious, there certainly was a right arm, taken off at the elbow, lying in a pool of blood. and the piece of uniform on it was something Rye would never mistake. After the wagon had left the village and run along the road for a while, it began to climb a slope. "What the hell are those guys?" Rye asked Dee, who hadn't said a thing since they'd set out. The boy had held his tongue because he was engulfed by Dee's aura, and also because the role of the simple traveler he'd assumed required that he avoid anything related to that song. "Itinerant warriors, all of them quite skilled," Dee replied softly. "You mean to tell me you've already fought them?" Rye asked, as the incredible sights of the night before skimmed through his brain. Although he knew nothing of the blood-and youth, he'd seen one of his compatriots slice a snake to bits with a single stroke of his hand, and watched another swallow a massive serpent. What's more, based on the brawl a short while ago, the same individual was apparently capable of vanishing completely. These abilities put them far beyond any warrior's Rye had ever known, and yet the man that was with him right now had fought them off with ease. Rye became terribly excited. "Hey, who are these guys you're talking about?" said Amne, as she worked the steering wheel. The girl was a veritable mass of curiosity. "A trio that attacked me. He just told you they were warriors." "Well, they're in the village, you know," Amne said, taking no notice of the surprise on Rye's face. "They're staying at the Merchant Inn. There was a note posted on the message board that said, 'Swords for hire.'" "There have been bandits around the village recently, so the mayor will probably hire them. If they're any good, that is." And then, in a strangely self-conscious manner, the girl asked, "And, what is it that you do?" "I'm a hunter," Dee replied succinctly. "A hunter? You don't mean to tell me you're a vampire hunter? That is so cool," Amne said, looking back at him. By the age of 17 or 18, most people had a better understanding of what hunters were really like, but this girl seemed to be an exception. But it was certainly true that the relatively rare vampire hunters were regarded with a reverence not afforded other monster-slaying experts. "In that case, you could take care of those three, no sweat. Even if the nobility have returned to the mansion, there won't be any problem." "They've returned, you say?" asked Dee. "That's the rumor. Almost 20 years ago," Rye began, recounting the tale exactly as Amne had told it to him. Dee listened without saying a word, but then he suddenly turned his gaze forward. Following his lead, Rye let a gasp escape. Nestled in the sea of green into which the narrow road dissolved was a magnificent mansion that could almost be mistaken for a palace. "What's the matter? Haven't you ever seen one before?" Amne teased, but the boy didn't even seem to notice. The closest of the nobility's castles was still 100 miles or more from Rye's village, no small distance. While he'd heard vile tales about them before bedtime, he'd never actually seen a real noble. What's more, there was the matter of the song. "Are there any victims of the nobility left in your village?" asked Dee. "Don't make me laugh. They were all disposed of. I'm sure it's the same everywhere." "That's not necessarily the case. When someone didn't completely become one of them, there have been cases where their family took pity on them and kept them hidden and locked in the basement. That's revolting. In that case, what are they supposed to do after that? Victims who have progressed to a certain degree toward becoming nobility stop aging. If their family died out, would those things just be left living alone in the basement till the end of time? I wonder what they do about food. Would hunger torment them for all eternity? You just say whatever the hell you feel like, don't you? Rye said, his voice laden with anger. You can put down the nobility all you like, but their victims are human, just like us. You could choose your words a little better. What are you putting on airs all of a sudden for? If you've been bitten once by the nobility, you're one of them, and that's all there is to it. You're such a softy. Rye was disgusted. Was that all this girl who'd been so worked up about the whatever it was club at school had to say? She was far too callous. And you've spent too much time with your nose in books. Oh, is that a fact? After that, no one said anything, and the three of them merely listened to the rumble of the engine. The front gates grew closer. Stop here, said Dee. My, aren't we going into the courtyard? I heard a horse whinnying. It seems someone else has got in here first. Rye and Amne looked at each other. You suppose it's those guys? Asked the boy. The wagon stopped. Dee got out first, saying, You'd better stay put. But, Rye protested, those men are after you. Oh, great. You mean to tell me there are people on your trail? Put a cork in it. While the two of them were arguing, Dee raced over to the gate with his coat streaming out behind him. Pushing the rusted iron panel open, he entered the courtyard. The garden where women in white dresses and men in black capes had come long ago to admire the elegance of the night was now laid bare to the light of the sun, leaving the ravages of time painfully displayed. Various spots around the white mansion that had been destroyed must have been the work of villagers who'd slipped in after the nobility had left. Dee entered the vestibule. Its large door had collapsed. Welcome, a youthful voice called down to him. Quietly looking up, he found a golden light that danced on the landing directly ahead of him, where the two staircases leading to the second floor converged. Blonde hair. The cold and youthful face it framed played host to a refined smile. Forgive our lack of manners last night. Seeing that you've made it out here, I take it Kurt must have been wounded. The young man hadn't said his compatriot had been killed. His assessment was right on the mark. You got here fast, said Dee. I flew. Oh, forgive me for not introducing myself earlier. I'm Price. Dee. The way the young man's changed expression was a sight to see. His face suddenly filled with fear and regret, but he grinned then, nevertheless. The vampire hunter, Dee. I should have realized as much the moment I first gazed on your beauty. It's an honor to meet you. I've heard talk about you as well, Dee said emotionlessly. Oh, really? What kind of things? That you'd sign on for killing women and children so long as there was a paycheck in it for you. You're a real piece of work. Price was at a loss for an answer. Ordinarily those words were condemnation, but when they came from Dee's lips, they could also be taken as a compliment. What brings you out here anyway? Asked the young man. How about you? I'm loath to reply, but since it's you asking, I'm on a journey to find the origin of that song. You heard it in your mother's womb, so why have you suddenly come out here? Well, actually, Price began, hemming and hawing. Perhaps he'd never given the matter any thought. First, kindly answer my question. Why would the world's greatest living vampire hunter call on ruins the nobility have long since abandoned? One above, the other below, and between the two dashing figures there flowed an ineffable air of the uncanny. There's something I would make clear, said Price. We've already found an employer. Kindly keep in mind that our actions in the village are backed by a figure of no small standing. And this figure wants me defeated. Dee asked softly. Price's expression stiffened. 20 years ago, the nobles that departed this place returned. A number of people heard that song. And now their children have come back here at the very same time. Why is that? 20 years... 20 years ago. 20 years ago, the nobles that departed this place returned. A number of people heard that song, and now their children have come back here at the very same time. Why is that? Said the hunter, the black depths of his eyes transfixing Price. A pair of blue eyes counterattacked. It was almost as if two exquisite sculptures had suddenly appeared in a hall previously filled by naught but desolation. First part end. Second part. Why is that? Dee said, his voice echoing off into the vast stillness. A bead of sweat rolled down Price's cheek. Answer me. As Dee's command shouted out like a coup de grace, a bass growl rolled across the floor from the doorway to the hunter's rear. Bajima. Price said, his face flushing with joy. Apparently free of Dee's spell now, he used one hand to rub at his eyes. Looks like even you're not... Looks like you're not even too good at handling Vampire Hunter D. That's a little sad. If the 10-foot-tall, four-legged creature with 3 heads in the doorway had said that, it would have been more ridiculous than astonishing. From the tops of its heads to the tip of its tail, the armored beast's entire body was covered with glossy black steel, and behind it stood the man in uniform. Make one move and he'll chomp down on you, D, and I'll snap the necks of these two to boot. His arms pulled in tighter, and within them, the faces of Ryan Omne contorted with so much as a cry. You see, you can't go head-to-head with a vampire hunter of your notoriety without getting some leverage. So go ahead and answer Price's question, D. The man in the uniform, Bajima, bared his yellow teeth. It's only fair to warn you that this beastie was a watchdog left behind by the southern nobility. The alloy armor covering its body could stand up to a direct hit from a small nuclear device, and look what else it can do. Molten swirls of color shot by D on either side. The dog had spat them up. Flames that could melt iron hit the floor 60 feet away, spreading a carpet of spiteful hues. Can you cut your way through fire, D? No. If you value your life, and those of your two friends, you better come clean with us. Now there are two. Now there are two, Dee said as flames flickered across his face, who need to answer. Bijima's complexion grew even paler than Price's. He realized that he and Price were the two to whom the hunter referred. "Kill him," he shouted. But perhaps that was too rash for a man who thought he held the trump card. At the same time, the beast's trio of heads lunged forward. They also spat flames that the vampire hunter dashed straight into. "What the hell?" Bijima exclaimed, forgetting all about breaking the necks of his two prisoners. Every guard of flame directed at Dee had been split down the middle, allowing him to pass. The instant the villain realized the undeity's skill behind the blade he faced, he put all his crushing strength into his arms. But his captives didn't move. Looking down in disbelief, he found sticks of unfinished wood running through both his elbows. "Ah!" he bellowed, his wail as regrettable as it was disgraceful. But naturally his cry did nothing to stay Dee's naked steel. With a resounding crunch, the beast's three heads were severed. But Dee then halted right in front of the body as it spouted fountains of black blood. Even the decapitated torso seemed to lose itself in the sound of the song. The faces of all present, including Dee himself, turned in a heartbeat toward a little door to the rear of the hall. Seeing Price spring into action, Rai started to run as well. Bijima had already released his prisoners and leapt out into the courtyard. One of Dee's hands stopped Rai. Taking a quick glance in the direction where Bijima had made his escape, the hunter then dashed for the door a second later. He was only a few paces from it when it slammed shut. There was the sound of a lock being thrown. Without stopping, Dee hit the door shoulder first. Though it creaked, it didn't open. In this mansion of the nobility, the doors were made with nobles in mind. Finally, on the third try, the lock gave way. Beyond it lay a corridor. About 15 feet from them, Price was frozen in his tracks. He was facing Dee, and he seemed exhausted. "Did you hear it?" "I heard it," Dee replied. It was a beautiful tune. Aside from the voice, that is. The singer definitely had been a young woman. The singer had definitely been a young man. "Do you think it was a noble?" "No, it couldn't possibly be. No noble could ever have a voice like that." "Who was it then?" As Price continued to talk, Dee checked all around them for any sign of another presence, but he soon turned his back to the warrior. Rai and Amne were standing in the doorway. "Is he gone?" The hunter nodded faintly in reply to Rai's query. "Everyone who sings that song goes, 'Even my father's gone. Let's leave,'" said Dee. Price watched in silence as the three figures vanished into the hall. Ever so sadly he watched, as if he were the last living creature on earth. Second part, end. Third part. After parting company with Amne, who seemed to want to ask him something but was strangely unable to do so, Rai holed up in his hotel room. The singing voice still rang in his head. Was that voice the same one that his father and Price had heard? No, he thought it couldn't be, but he didn't know why. He'd asked Dee about it, but hadn't gotten any answer. Having fretted until sundown, Rye finally went to the room beside his to see Dee. Upon returning to the village, the hunter had also checked into the hotel. Never even bothering to take off his coat, the figure in black was seated in a chair by the window. The village was growing a deepening blue. A strange sense of reality askew enveloped the boy, for he just wondered if perhaps it hadn't been the hunter that had sung the song himself. He, of all people, could make sprites and moonlight captives of a single-minded sentiment merely by singing the poignant nocturne to himself. "What is it?" asked he. "Nothing much. I just wanted to talk to you a little." "Then take a seat." Dee then asked, "Why have you come here?" To be honest, Rye was elated that the hunter was interested in him. Once he'd finished telling Dee the story about his father, he said, "I wondered what it would be like to meet the person that sang that song. If at all possible, I'd like to hear it right from their lips. That's all I want. Once that's done, I'll go home." He continued, "But I wonder what kind of noble it was. The thought of one of them luring people there with just a song, and the people who'd keep them bidden didn't attack their own families, but merely wandered the night singing the song. You ever hear of a noble like that before?" "No." "No," Dee replied as he continued to look out the window. Out in a world shuttered by darkness, lamps had begun to shine here and there. There are various kinds of nobles. Perhaps there are nobles who aren't nobility at all. You can't be serious." At that moment, a knock sounded. Rye stood at the ready. He thought it might be the same trio that was after him, but he was incorrect. The caller was a servant from the mayor's home. He explained that his employer had learned that the famed vampire hunter Dee had called on the village, and was most eager to discuss some work with him. He also said his employer wanted the hunter to come right away. Dee agreed. The servant added that the other young man was also to accompany them, and that they needed to discuss the matter of the nocturne. Although Rye got no answer when he asked how the mayor knew about him, he decided to comply. As they headed east toward the estate, Rye rode in the coach that had been sent for them a while. Dee took his newly purchased cyborg horse. In an opulent living room befitting the head of a wealthy village, the mayor waited with 3 men. Price Bijima with his pair of bandaged elbows, and Kurt with a missing arm. The Rye was tense. Dee went impassively to the seat that had been indicated. Heavy curtains were drawn across the windows. "Welcome, Vampire Hunter Dee. I'm Mayor Cobier," the silver-haired woman said, showing them a forceful smile. "And these 3, as you can see, are in my employ. For, you see, a certain objectionable rumor has been brought to my attention." "And that is?" Dee asked, ignoring the trio that stood behind Mayor Cobier, as if they didn't even exist. "That the nobles have returned once more." "Did you say once more?" "Yes." "Yes. They came back on one other occasion, nearly 20 years ago. At that point, using earplugs and keeping our doors locked had become the norm, so there were no victims. I hope this time we can say the same. I should like to have you join forces with these 3 and destroy the nobility." Stealing a glance at the horrified trio, Rye averted his gaze after catching a look of egregious resentment from Kurt. Needless to say, I'll pay whatever compensation you desire, and you shall be in charge of the group. Now Rye was staring at the trio again in amazement. Bajima and Kurt looked dejected, and Price's exquisite countenance was etched with an ironic smile, but none of the three said a single word. They must have been promised a considerable sum to agree to such conditions. However, there was no chance of the hunter ever accepting the offer. "Very well," said D. "But you're to leave the entire matter to me. You cannot countermand me." "Understood," the mayor replied. Clearly this woman was quite competent at running this village, and with good reason. "So what would you have the three of us do, boss?" Price asked, his words mixed with a bitter grin. Walking over to the window, Dee pushed aside the curtains and looked out into the darkness, in the direction of the mansion. "Next, we'll be heading up to the mansion. Bijima, you take the boy back to the hotel." "Pardon my saying so, but I went over every inch of that place," said Price. "I didn't find anyone." "Apparently they can't be seen," Dee said, without ever taking his eyes off the window. Perhaps sensing something, he pulled the curtain back as Price was about to walk over. It was the mayor that gasped. What Rye felt was terror and a strange sense of relief. It seemed that his journey hadn't been a waste. The lights of various villages were scattered in the distance. In one spot on the towering mountain, whose outline only added to the darkness, a little light winked on, announcing to all the world the return of the fiends. After Price and Kurt left with Dee, Rye stayed on at the mayor's house. He'd been told it would be safer than the hotel, and the mayor didn't feel right about him riding back after dark. Bajima told him he should do it too, before he made himself scarce. "I heard about you from those three men. They say you were traveling all alone. What a brave young man you must be." "I guess. Why have you come to our village? Are you drawn by the song, just like Price?" "That's right." And then, in response to her questions, Rye told her all about his father and the song. Staring coldly at the curtains her servants had drawn, the mayor said, "That song is the devil's work." It almost sounded as if she were talking to herself. The nobility made the song to lure the villagers. Those they called never came home again. It's a cursed melody that should never pass anyone's lips. And that's why it's so beautiful. But I heard everybody that was called came back. The mayor cackled. Rye was actually a little surprised that this woman could laugh. "The girl at the hotel fed you that malarkey, did she? You see, all the victims of the nobility became their servants. Do you know of any exceptions?" "No, they all went off, even my own child." Lightning knifed through Rye's spine. If this woman who seemed to be around 60 had lost a child, then the nobility's return 20 years earlier was more than just a legend. "I was so busy with my housework that I completely ignored my child. I paid no attention to the angry threats about going off to the noble's mansion, and ever since, I've lived alone." Somewhere, a clock chimed. Patting her silvery mane, the mare got to her feet. "Join me for supper," she said, "and once that's finished, it'll be time for you to go to bed." Page break. Even after they dismounted at the gates, the light didn't go out. It burned at the far end of the mansion's right wing, in a lone room. There's no way they wouldn't have noticed us, and whoever it is, they must underestimate us, Price said sarcastically. Although travelers might visit a noble manor, no one would ever stay in one overnight. In any case, the occupant showed considerable courage. Circle around to the garden. I'll go in through the door. Check. Taking the silent and sullen Kurt with him, Price dashed off. Once he saw the two men disappear, Dee stepped into the mansion. Casually making his way through the hall, he headed toward the corridor at the back. Turning at the end of it, he moved into the right wing. His gait was steady as always, and both his arms hung by his sides. Presently he came to a halt. Before him loomed an elaborately carved door. When his black glove pushed against it, it opened without the slightest resistance. Dee silently stood in the flickering light. The canopied bed, the writing desk set by the bay window, the chic ebony cabinet, and the white lace curtains swaying by the windows were covered with a white dust. They were clearly the trappings of a woman's room. Dee walked over to the little table, with the silver candelabra resting on it, the source of the light. Someone must have made us of the things that had been left here. The blue candles had burned down halfway in their holders. A trace of the room's occupant lingered in the air, an almost imperceptible chill, probably from the breath of a noble. Dee approached the bed. Taking 2 steps, his body suddenly became a blur. Sinking into the ceiling with a mellifluous sound was a steel arrow. With a single bound, Dee was back at the doorway. There was no one out in the corridor. The hall directly opposite the door now had 3 needles of unfinished wood sticking from it. All of them had been hurled by Dee, just as his longsword swiped out to deflect the deadly missile. And none of them were missing. His opponent was worthy of kudos. "Not too shabby," said a hoarse voice. It came from Dee's left hand, which had taken hold of a needle. After pulling all 3 out of the wall, Dee turned around. Perhaps the singer had been waiting for the night. How many people knew what the word nocturne meant? It was a song that loved the night, a song for those awaiting a lover in the darkness. The hem of the hunter's coat flashed out. A wind had blown from the corridor and into the room. Dee advanced without a word. Light filled the space. Ignoring the very laws of physics, moonlight shone in through windows on 3 walls to focus on a single spot. And there was the singer. Page break. You might say it was the instinct of a frontier creature that roused Rye from his sleep. As soon as his eyes were open, they were drawn to just one thing. The doorknob. It was moving, slowly turning, even though the boy was sure he'd locked it. Rye heard the creak of the hinges. The figure that crept in across the floor and came all the way over to the side of the bed without the boys being able to move a muscle. Rye was too busy listening to the song. It issued from the mouth of the shadowy figure that was slowly leaning over him. Chapter 2, End. Melody on a White Moonlit Night. Chapter 3, First Part. The moonlight passed right through the woman and bleached the floor. A number of the flecks of light glittered on her body, accenting the flow of her long hair and the pleats of her dress, and making her look like something from beyond the grave. "When did you return?" Dee inquired softly. "I never went anywhere at all," she replied, her voice resounding in Dee's head. "I've been here all along. The only reason none of you noticed me was because I didn't sing." "And that song, who taught it to you?" "I don't recall," she answered immediately. There's little point in asking who taught me it or when. All I know is how to sing. And then let me ask you this. Who decided when you'd sing? And how and why were the selections made? The woman turned to Dee without a sound. Not even the air stirred. Perhaps both the woman and the room were mere illusions. Maybe even Dee himself was one. What brings you here, you gorgeous man? Even my song will be no more than noise in your presence. I feel I may even forget how to sing. That song isn't to be sung, said Dee. At some point he'd taken a place by the woman's side. It's a song that a certain man had his musicians compose, and he made a certain woman sing it. The effect it had wasn't what the man intended, and that's why it can't be allowed to remain in this world. The woman's sparkling eyes reflected Dee's image. Through her dreamlike form, the window to her rear and even the very moonlight was visible. Are you... The woman began, her thoughts swimming. Your face, your bearing, so like him. You couldn't be. Without a single wasted motion, Dee drew his blade and slashed through the woman's torso. The silvery flash left a trail through her body like the Milky Way, but it disappeared almost instantly. Dee didn't launch a second attack. The first had merely been a tentative strike. Although the woman existed, she wasn't real. To cut an illusion given shape, even Dee would need a very special sword technique. The woman's outline rapidly grew hazy, and like a dream as its dreamer is about to awaken. I'm always here. Come any time you like. From behind Dee came the rasp of a sword being unsheathed. A few seconds later, another sound entered the room. It was Price and Kurt. Where's the singer? Price asked as he gingerly surveyed the room. The handsome young man must have heard her as well. She's right here, Dee replied, gazing at a spot over by the windows. I don't see a damn thing. Kurt spat venomously. Sheesh, you let her get away. And after all that talk, I've heard about you being the best vampire hunter on the frontier. She never would have escaped if I'd been here, I tell you. His caustic remarks sprang from hard feelings over the arm he'd lost. I'm a tad disappointed in you, Price said in a sarcastic tone. There was a dull thud as the steel arrow fell at his feet. What's this? Which one of you does that belong to? Asked the hunter. This thing. What are you trying to get at? That arrow was fired at me earlier. As Price's gaze fell upon him, Kurt lowered his eyes. I thought I told you not to. Hell, an arrow like that could have come from anywhere, Kurt retorted in an unsteady tone. We split up in the garden, but I didn't think he was going off to take a shot at you. You have my apologies, Price said before making an obsequious bow to Dee. It won't happen again. I ask your forgiveness. You've got to be kidding me. There's no reason you should be bowing your head to this joker. If I get half a chance, I'll kill him for sure. The man in the military garb blustered, but an icy tone informed him. You'll never get another opportunity. It sounded as if it could freeze the very moonlight. You dirty. Kurt started to say as his left hand reached for his chest. Arrows that had been tucked in his uniform jutted out, and becoming flashes of black concentrated on Dee. But all of them seemed to be batted away by a single streak of white light. The man's left hand was about to unleash another assault, when a naked blade made a diagonal cut through him. Sliced from the left shoulder to the right hip, the upper portion of Kurt's body didn't begin to smoothly slide off the lower half until after Dee's blade was back in its sheath. Are you going to bury him? Freed from his paralysis by the hunter's question, Price could finally move again. You. You're not much for forgiveness, are you? He stammered. Though his remark invited side-splitting laughter, it rang with the brutal reality of what had just transpired. He hadn't been able to so much as lift a finger, while his comrade was slaughtered before his very eyes. You heard the woman's song, correct? Dee said as he faced the windows. Hers had been a modest tone, and it didn't seem the least bit likely to have carried all the way down to the garden. If you could hear it out there, it may have reached the village too. Let's head back. If you could hear it out there, it may have reached the village too. Let's head back. Even after the graceful figure in black had slipped through the doorway, Price had to stand there a little while longer before the spell over him was completely broken. Page break. Shaken firmly, Rye reflexively tried to sit up. It took a few seconds for his retinas to confirm the presence of Dee and the mare. "What is it?" the boy asked. In lieu of a reply, a black glove reached out to grab his chin, turning his face to the left and the right. Oddly enough, the treatment didn't feel all rough to him. "There's not a mark on him, is there?" the mayor said with apparent relief. "What's going on?" A man so handsome to his sleeping eyes he had to wonder if he was still dreaming asked, "Did you hear the song?" Narrowing his eyes, Rye traced back through his memories. "Nope. Although I was asleep, so I really don't know." But he couldn't be sure if his answer was correct. To cover this, he asked ill-temperedly, "What the hell time is it anyway?" "It's the middle of the night. Go back to sleep." With these words, Dee returned to the living room. Price and Bijima were waiting there. Although it wouldn't have been at all surprising if they'd been on edge, the atmosphere was painfully commonplace. "You must really be something to take old Kurt out with one shot," Bijima said, sounding more excited than anything. "Now I get a bigger share of what the mayor's paying us. Thanks." He didn't hear the song, Price said as his eyes knifed his compatriot. "When the noble sings, there's some sort of selection," Mayor Colbier said, pawing at her silver hair. "In the legends from 2 centuries ago, the only ones entranced by the song were young people around 20 years of age. The same goes for 20 years ago." "A noble that only wants the blood of kids, eh? That's a new one," Bijima remarked. Eyeing the door to Rye's bedroom, the mayor continued, "However, that boy didn't hear it. If there'd been anything outside of the ordinary, I'd have long since been notified about it." "Perhaps he doesn't remember." 3 pairs of eyes focused on Dee. The hue of surprise melted into infatuation, as was always the case. Not surprisingly, Price was the first one to return to his senses. "You mean the boy? But if he didn't go out to the mansion and there's no trace of the accursed kiss left on him, I don't see what the problem is." The mayor nodded her agreement. "Actually, nothing strange happened to me either. I think the song last night didn't have the power of the nobility behind it." Dee's eyes swallowed Price. "Perhaps only one person was chosen." "Chosen?" The mayor and Price looked at each other. The eyes of one of them filled with a horribly keen light as they bored through the young man in black. "There's something I'd like to ask, too," said Price. Dee was silent. "What brings you to this village? Up until now, I thought it was merely a coincidence. But do you know something?" "The singer is in the mansion," Dee said. "That's the only person who knows everything." We should get some rest. First part, end. Second part. Why are you so out of it? At this unexpected remark, Rai turned sideways. Amne was there. Her hair was pulled back in a ponytail, and she wore a pair of thin slacks. The rather generous swell in her yellow blouse made the boy a bit nervous. Since you never came back, I just came to check up on you. Whether you use it or not, you're still gonna have to pay for the room, you know. I know that, Rai said, leaning against a nearby tree trunk while his eyes fell on a glittering band some 15 or 20 feet away. Flowing from a mountain spring, about 12 miles to the north, the river helped give the scene a grim majesty. The spray, sent out by a collection of boulders, allowed pure white blossoms to bloom, and countless rainbows sprang to life in the sunlit gaps between flowers. As proof that these were no ordinary trick of the light, when the silvery fish shot from the surface of the river and broke through them, their tiny mouths pulled multicolored bits from them, and the rainbows were clearly being whittled down. The roar of the river was reminiscent of a rumbling in the ground. They were by the road that ran from the mayor's house into the heart of town. There wasn't any sign of travelers along the river banks. You're not in very good spirits, are you? What's wrong? Nothing, really. It's not nothing, I'd say. You seemed like a completely different person yesterday. Now you're really such a brooder. That's a hell of a thing to say to one of your guests. Okay, Omne said, pointing to the electric-powered wagon that was parked a short distance from them. In that case, allow me to show our guests some hospitality. I'll give you a guided tour of the noble remains around the village, based on a map drawn by the Anise Historical Research Society. Not interested, Rai replied, pulling away. What's this? Yesterday you were overjoyed to go for a ride. Oh, I get it. Now that there's been a little excitement, you're lost your nerve, haven't you? That's right. Coward. I'm just a plain old traveler. I don't have any interest in the damn nobility. That's a lie. The interest you showed yesterday was certainly real enough. So off you go to stay at the mayor's house when I'm not looking. Looks like you've got plenty of secrets. You've got me all wrong. Whatever. Come with me. After all, you'll get to see the sights for free. It couldn't hurt to look. And I'll show you something special to sweeten the deal. Oh, what's that? The boy asked with no apparent interest. To be honest, Rai was a bit anxious. In answer to Dee's question, he'd said there was nothing out of the ordinary. But in truth he couldn't remember anything about the previous night. His memories ended with him climbing into bed. It was unusual for Rai, who always stayed quite alert until the second he fell asleep. What's more, he couldn't shake the feeling he was being followed by someone. When he'd woken up that morning, Dee, the two warriors, and even the mayor had already left, but one of the mayor's servants had conveyed her orders that he stayed at her house from that night on. He'd run into Amne as he was going off to collect his things and bring them back. One of those four was probably following him. Most likely it was Bijima, though he'd have to be doing a pretty sloppy job of it for Rai to notice him. I'll tell you what the bonus is if you get in the wagon, said the girl. I don't want anyone else to hear. This would probably be a very good way to lose his unseen pursuer. Okay, I'll go with you, Rai said reluctantly. But in return, you've got to forget about the charge for my room. Hey, that's a whole different matter. In that case, count me out. Okay, I get the point. You're a real tightwad, you know. Omne said irritably, although his cheapness was only natural. The wagon carried them south for about a mile, and a quarter before it stopped. They were out in a field quite some distance from the main road. though it looked as if flames of green were blazing across the grasslands as far as the eye could see. In spots here and there, chunks of black stuck out like a sore thumb. These were clearly the remains of a massive structure. On this spot stood one of the nobility's research centers or factories. Lately, though, the opinion that it was another kind of facility has been gaining strength. What kind of facility? A concert hall. You don't say. Rai replied as he looked up at the heavens. White clouds frolicked like kittens in the blue sky. And just whose voice this theory? Yours truly. Give me a break. And the boy snorted. No matter whose theory it is, what's true is true. At her passionate reply, Rai realized she had a point. Come this way. Doing as she said, Rai got out of the wagon and advanced across the grass to the largest of the ruins. Here it is, Omne declared, standing there with all the excitement and emotion befitting a girl her age. But ahead of her, all Rai could do was make fun of assorted piles of rubble from some unknown source. And where's this concert hall supposed to be? You can't tell just from looking at this. The basis of my theory is this way. It took a good 5 minutes to circle around behind the massive stone ruins. But how could anything this big and solid fall apart? It looks like it should have lasted thousands of years. Good question, said the girl. It didn't fall apart. It was knocked down. What, by the villagers? I'd heard that while some of the nobles' castles fell into ruin, it was impossible to destroy them. There are some that could be destroyed and others that couldn't. This is one of the ones that couldn't be wrecked, but a noble could do it. You mean on purpose? That's the only thing I can think of. The two of them stood in front of a stone pillar about 30 feet from the heart of the ruins. Why would they have done that? Rai inquired, feeling slightly dizzy. I don't know. Maybe it broke some sort of taboo. Maybe they just didn't need it anymore. But based on how thorough the devastation is, it sure must have been one hell of a good reason. To destroy a concert hall. Your theory is starting to sound pretty shaky. Nuts to you. Let's see what you have to say after you've seen this. Omne said, approaching the stone pillar with a sullen expression. Bending over, she touched her hand to a spot at the base, and the pillar spun around smoothly. A hole 10 feet in diameter now lay where the stone column had towered. Don't just stand there with your mouth hanging open. Pick your jaw back up, Omne said triumphantly. You see, I found the switch during my investigations. Want to go down? What's down there? I've no idea. Actually, I've never descended before. So you mean you simply found it, and that's all? I'm a historical investigator, you know, not an adventurer. Oh, so you'd leave all the dirty work for the boys, then? Wonderful. I've heard enough out of you. Get going already. Well, I'm not an adventurer either, Rai told her. You're a man, aren't you? Don't you want to see what's down there? If you discover booty left by the nobility, it could be worth a fortune. Putting his hand to his face, Rai wiped away his sweat. The sunlight was too strong. It looked so cool down in the hole. I'll give it a shot, he said. That's the spirit. From the brink of the hole, a set of whitish stone stairs descended into the ground. Once they were 5 steps down, the chilly air swept over Rai. At the same moment, the lights came up. A lamp in the wall had gone on. It still works. Can you believe this thing? We're talking about the nobility here, Omne reminded him. The nobility. A short while later they reached the bottom. There was a corridor and the ceiling was fairly high. I wonder which way we should go, Omne said, looking around in all directions anxiously. This way, Rye told her, pointing one way as he began walking. Even he wasn't sure why he'd chosen this particular route. Proceeding straight down the corridor, they came to a black steel door. As they stood before it, it split open right down the middle. The darkness beyond it was dispelled by the very same devices that had done so on the stairs. Taking a step in, the pair then froze in their tracks. In the ash-gray space that seemed to have been scooped out of the very rock, countless humans lay like ghouls. Though their garments were filthy and tattered, they were those of ordinary villagers. The stark and waxy luster of their faces was not the fault of the lights. What? What the hell are they? Rye said, trying to keep his knees from buckling. I don't know. Maybe they're people who were bitten by the nobility. No, they don't have a mark from the noble's kiss. And having spoken, Rye turned around. Omne had just drawn a sharp breath. The girl had her fist to her mouth. Look. The clothes on those people over there. They're awfully old-fashioned. But these ones are just like my own. Could it be... Are these the victims from before the nobility disappeared? And then the people who were bitten when they came back again 20 years ago? I already told you, they haven't been bitten. Rye snapped irritably. But then he froze. His face turned to Omne of its own accord. Omne was looking at him as well. These are the people called here by the song, she said in a tone without cadence. Second part, end. Third part. Weren't they killed? Omne shook her head at Rye's question. They lived, but I wonder who could have hit them down here. I don't know about 200 years ago, but how about the families of the victims from 20 years back? Who knows? That time there weren't very many of them at all. Look, 1, 2, 3 of them all told, and on top of everything, they're with the people from 200 years ago, of all things. You know, we should go back to town and ask around about it. Just then, Rye caught a certain scent. Hey, you're not hurt anywhere, are you? Omne furrowed her brow, but it took less than a second for her expression of consternation to become one of horror. Bending over so quickly it was like she'd been snapped in half, she stared down at her right ankle. It's bleeding. I scraped it on the stone stairs on the way down, but... Rye's gaze was riveted on the people around the room, and how they'd started to stir, how their eyes had opened, and how they now got to their feet not with the jerky motions of a marionette, but slowly and smoothly. It doesn't really hurt. I just banged it up a little. Don't look straight ahead, Rye told her. The people in the chamber were already standing, staring at them. The pair began to back away. Omne turned her face to the floor. She just wanted to whip around and run like hell. But the others would probably break into a sprint as well. The change in Price's expression was truly a sight to see. Shades of something that wasn't quite perplexity alternated with a look akin to understanding. But before settling on either emotion, the warrior asked, why would he protect them? Doesn't seem to be out of some sort of youthful humanitarianism. And then his voice dipped lower, as if he'd suddenly thought of something, and he said, Are you certain nothing happened last night? Rai didn't answer. He couldn't. Not that it matters much. We've got to hurry up and take care of that group down below. Opening a flap on his uniform, Bijima pulled out a square lump. There was a slim silver tube stuck in it, a fuse, and the block was plastic explosive. Judging by the pinkish color, it was an incendiary charge. While the 50,000-degree blast might not kill true nobles, it would be far more than their servants could withstand. Bijima's thick fingers gave the fuse a twist, and then the man brought back his right arm for an underhand throw. Stop it. The boy was about to rush forward, when a flash of white stepped right in front of his nose. As he recoiled, the bomb flew in a parabolic arc over his head, but another line intersected it in midair, destroying the fuse alone. A stake of rough wood came down and stuck in the bushes. D. Both Rai and Omne shouted, while Price muttered the same name with infinite hatred. The blade he swung at Rai should have taken off the boy's head, but at the warrior's feet was the long, thin stake that had thrown his footwork into disarray. In a spot 15 feet from either of the warriors stood the vampire hunter in inky black, backed by a colossal carving of a demonic head, with eyes bulging and fangs bared. "What are you doing out here?" Price asked as he took a step back with his right leg to avoid the stick that had foiled him. When he and his compatriot had left the mayor's house, they'd come straight here, and they'd be given instructions from D that they'd be free to do what they liked until night. The ruins were something they learned about as a bar after they arrived in the village. I followed the boy. I followed the boy. I followed the boy. I followed the boy. D replies succinctly. I see. Let's call it a day then, Price said, returning his long sword to its sheath. But I will have to report back to the mayor the fact that you spared a horde of noble reserves. There's no need to do that. D replied, his voice borne on the wind, a wind with an edge like a knife. As Price stared at him in amazement, he continued, You were going to cut him down, weren't you? He was referring, of course, to Rai. A second later, Price decided what he had to do. There was no use trying to deny anything with this man. Keep out of this, he bade Bijima as he stepped to the fore. But as simple as that sounded, trying to take on D empty-handed was an act of complete insanity. A chill raced down Rai's spine. The other men looked so utterly defenseless, it was actually unsettling. D dashed forward, the wind swirling in his wake. A silvery glint raced from his scabbard, and right before the hunter's eyes, a vermilion flash flared into existence. Still stuck in the same pose as when he'd brought his blade down the first time, D made no second attack. But he hadn't slain his opponent. Price slipped back about 6 feet. In his face, a pair of red lights blazed. His eyes. How do you like my evil eyes? Price asked as he blinked. Anyone who saw the demonic red light that radiated from his pupils would be blinded instantaneously, and there was nothing they could do to restore their sight. It would also send enough pain searing through their brain to drive a person insane. The eyes had the very same effect on even the most vicious of beasts or demonic creatures. The fact that the young man in black still held his sword, or worse, that he was also still on his feet, could have only seemed like a miracle or a nightmare to Price. Now's our chance, let's kill him, and then we'll do the same to the freaks down below, Bijima urged, but a powerful hand stayed him. Fall back, said the handsome but pale warrior. What? Look, the blond warrior said, his trembling hand indicating his own front. Bajima took a sharp breath despite himself. Price's chest had been slashed in a straight line from the base of his throat to his abdomen. Chapter 3 End. A peculiar scent spread through the room. A bit of red stained Omne's arm. As she struggled with all her strength to win her freedom, she'd been clawed by fingernails in the process. "Dee!" Omne cried. The mayor's daughter opened her mouth and revealed a pair of fangs. It was the basement of the concert hall all over again. Apparently, they'd only been able to get past the scent of Price's blood, but when all of them charged toward Omne, each was pierced through the chest, either by a wooden stake or naked steel. The mayor's daughter fell to the floor, and in a matter of seconds she turned to dust. Like the fine powder that shrouded the history of this house, her remains shimmered in the moonlight. Only Rai remained. I haven't spreaded fangs yet, but who can say when that'll happen? I'd probably be better off just having you run through right now. Stop it, Omne shouted as she jumped between him and the hunter. The mayor and I keep watch, and we'll see what happens. If he winds up like the nobility, well, then we'll... Omne hiccuped. She said they hadn't done the last part to him yet, right? Apparently freed now of her daughter's powers, she shook her head as she spoke. That being the case, I suppose there's a chance he might go back to being a normal human being. However, then she broke off. I really don't know, she continued. Even though I talked with my daughter so many times about humans and nobles, there is no way to be certain. Dee could probably handle the monsters somehow. However, Ryan Omne would undoubtedly be peering into the abyss of death within 5 seconds. Omne fainted without so much as making a peep. And that's when it happened. The song that rose from the depths of the earth seemed to shower midday with the still of night. More than the agitated monstrosities, it was the entrance to the underground chamber that drew Rai's gaze. Before his eyes, the unearthly creatures rustled back through the grass like a torrent, surging toward the hole. They became a multicolored stream that poured directly down the stairway, driven by the unholy tune in a march to their own death. Son of a... Bajima snarled in anger, throwing better judgment to the wind. He drew his broadsword and charged straight at Dee. It was the biggest mistake of his life. Though Dee supposedly couldn't see, his blade left a silvery streak in the air. Even as he felt something hot in the vicinity of his torso, Bajima kept running out of habit and fell headlong into the hole. Rai raced over to Dee. Price had headed for the hills as soon as Bajima turned his blade on Dee. That was incredible. You dropped that bastard with one shot. You can see after all. But after the boy spoke, he quickly bit his tongue. Dee's eyes remained firmly shut, and yet after returning the blade to its scabbard, the figure in black suddenly started walking around. Is the hole over here? He asked, turning in the proper direction with ease. Rai was filled to the ears with such awe, it made him tremble as he gazed at the hunter, and then he shouted, "It's closing." But his cry came too late. The massive stone column spun in the opposite direction of when it had opened, and before Dee could even take a step toward it, the hole in the ground was sealed forever. Beige break indicated by a small cross. It was just about time for the forest and river to sink into a faint blue hue when they returned to the mayor's house. The blind D had said he was going to go check on another set of ruins, and though he wasn't the kind of man who'd ask them to lead him there, Ryan Umney decided to accompany him. Amazingly enough, he seemed to be able to see everything around them better than either the boy or the girl. When they started to head into the woods because it was a shortcut, Dee quickly ordered them to the wagon's top-up. Doing as he said without even knowing why, they didn't have a minute to spare before a swarm of venomous golden wasps attacked. These creatures wouldn't leave until they saw their prey dead, and they swarmed in wave after wave. The only ways to escape were to kill them all, to remain concealed, or to suffer through sting after painful sting. But Dee chose yet another course. He thrust his blade right into the heart of the buzzing insects through the wagon's covering. When he pulled his weapon back inside again, the golden queen of the swarm was impaled on the tip of its blade. Now leaderless, the wasps immediately dispersed, since he'd struck through the wagon's covering, and the hunter couldn't see his target. The only thing he had to rely on was the fact that the sound of the queen's wings differed from that of the other wasps. Apparently, Dee's hearing was so keen he could accurately discern that one sound of the buzz of thousands of wings. In the vicinity of the village, there were more than a dozen ruins. Vacation lodges for the nobility, arenas for mechanical gladiators, dams to alter the flow of the river however they pleased, and standing alone amid these decaying heaps of ancient rubble, floored in green grass, the young men in black truly looked like some beautiful illusion. But illusions ultimately vanish in time. What the boy and girl saw was nothing short of pure elegance and solitude, given human form. A vision that would never be allowed to fade. As Dee stood by a stone wall in the garden that had long since been reclaimed by the forest green, Rye walked over and quietly inquired, "You wouldn't by any chance happen to be a Dampier, would you?" "Can you tell?" asked Dee. Rye nodded. After all, the nobility's ruins just seemed to suit you too well. So well it's scary. For the first time in my life, I actually found myself thinking it'd be nice if more of the nobility's things had been left in the world. What's lost will never return. The sun has set on one world, and it won't see another dawn. That belongs to a different time. Are you talking about the nobility and us? Have you heard stories about the nobility? When I was a kid, I used to hear them all the time from an old chatterbox of a nanny, the boy replied. And do you remember them? Yeah, every last one. Were they scary stories? Pretty much. But there were some good ones too, stories about how some machine left behind by the nobility had healed someone of an incurable disease. I talk about the moon and the stars. Be sure to remember those, the hunter told him. Because that would have made the nobles happy. No. I don't imagine it would have mattered to them. They never would have wanted that. Perhaps it was their wish to wither away without anyone ever knowing it. Then there's no point in remembering, is there? Not where the nobility are concerned. Dee said, turning his unseeing gaze toward the castle walls. For a second, Rye thought the gorgeous hunter might just disappear in that direction. Reflecting and remembering only have meaning for those that do them. It's not a matter of learning or knowing something, but merely recollecting things from long ago. Maybe you could call it gratitude. Gratitude. As Dee stood by a stone wall in the garden that had long since been reclaimed by the forest green, Rye walked over and quietly inquired, "You wouldn't by any chance happen to be a Dampier, would you?" Can you tell? Asked Dee. Rye nodded. After all, the nobility's ruins just seem to suit you too well. So well it's scary. For the first time in my life, I actually found myself thinking it'd be nice if more of the nobility's things had been left in the world. What's lost will never return. The sun has set on one world, and it won't see another dawn. That belongs to a different time. Are you talking about the nobility and us? Have you heard stories about the nobility? When I was a kid, I used to hear them all the time from an old chatterbox of a nanny. The boy replied. And do you remember them? Yeah, every last one. Were they scary stories? Pretty much. But there were some good ones too, stories about how some machine left behind by the nobility had healed someone of an incurable disease. I talk about the moon and the stars. Be sure to remember those, the hunter told him. Because that would have made the nobles happy. No, I don't imagine it would have mattered to them. They never would have wanted that. Perhaps it was their wish to wither away without anyone ever knowing it. Then there's no point in remembering, is there? Not where the nobility are concerned. Dee said, turning his unseeing gaze toward the castle walls. For a second, Rye thought the gorgeous hunter might just disappear in that direction. Reflecting and remembering only have meaning for those that do them. It's not a matter of learning or knowing something, but merely recollecting things from long ago. Maybe you could call it gratitude. Gratitude. Although Rye tried to divine the meaning of the word from what Dee had said, he had little luck. He posed a different question. Why did you follow me anyway? Dee didn't say a word. Sensing something unapproachable in the hunter, Rye went back to where Omne waited and was terribly surprised. The headstrong girl who headed the Historical Research Society had tears glistening in her eyes. What's wrong with you? You look like hell. If you go and get all weepy every time you see a good-looking man, people will take you for a pumpkin. You ass, was all the girl could say before she hiccuped. Doesn't it make you sad? Don't you feel anything when you look at him? He's carrying a burden that's really, really old. The weight of what's already been lost. And because of it, I'm sure he'll never what? I don't know. I just can't find the right words. But you've got to be able to see it too. If you can't, you must be a real blockhead. As the girl's back shuddered again and again, Rye stroked it gently. I'm sorry, she said. I didn't mean to call you a blockhead. It's okay, I'm used to it. He's going to go away. Everyone does, you know? You're just a kid, so don't just regurgitate platitudes. But it's true, Rye told her. Even if we don't have any way of knowing just where it is we're going, the nobility didn't know. And we humans don't. Just as Omne's case of hiccups was getting especially bad, Dee came back. Did you make her cry? Asked the hunter. No way, Rye replied. You're going to be quite a heartbreaker. You're the last person I want to hear that from, the boy retorted. Shall we go? Sure, Omne said with a vigorous nod, her eyes swollen from her tears. First part end. Second part. There was no sign of a mare at her hose. Second part. There was no sign of the mare at her hose. When the servants were asked about her whereabouts, they said she didn't appear to have left. Second part. There was no sign of the mare at her hose. When the servants were asked about her whereabouts, they said she didn't appear to have left. I'm headed up to the mansion, said Dee. You two can come with me part of the way, and then head back to the inn. At this hour the sun will be down before we reach the inn, Rai countered. We'll stay here. If I lock the place up tight, it'll be fine. Plus, I've got earplugs. If the song was going to lure me away, I think it would have done so last night. But if you're that worried about us, hurry back. Understood, Dee said after eyeing first Omne, then Rai. Take good care of her, Heartbreaker. The boy didn't even have time to growl at that remark before Dee had gone. Darkness quickly descended. The mayor didn't come home. A servant showed the boy and girl to their respective bedrooms. Right after Rai climbed into bed, he heard a knock. Going over to the door, he asked who it was, and a female voice replied, Me. What is it? Open up. It's so creepy being all alone I can't get to sleep. Omni was dressed in pajamas. Rai recalled that 20 years earlier, the mayor had a child who'd been lured away by the song. Ah, girl, he said to himself. You're damn right I'm a girl. Where've your eyes been? No, I didn't mean you. Omni seemed to be glaring intently at the boy, but then she suddenly threw herself against him and told him to hold her. What for? I'm scared, you idiot. Though she clung to him despite his attempts to push her away, her zealous and feverish form made Rai think of something. Suddenly the voice said, You know, I'll be moving on soon, too. Stop trying to be like Mr. D. Back at our inn, we're short-handed and could use some help, Omne said, putting her strength into the arm she twined around Rai. Heartlessly prying his way free of the girl, Rai got to his feet. The severity of the gaze he concentrated on the door made Omne's anger turn to fear. What is it? The girl asked. Someone's coming. What? From the first floor. They'll be coming up the stairs any minute now. And there's a bunch of them. Well, I don't hear anything. And how come you know all this? But Rai couldn't afford to let that question leave him reeling. The footsteps from the first floor were now climbing the staircase, and even Omne could hear them gathering just beyond the door. I don't like this, said the girl. Who on earth could it be? I didn't think there were even that many people in the whole house. Just as Rai was considering an escape through the window, there was the sound of the lock being disengaged, and the door slowly opened. The figure that waded into the feeble light was familiar to the two of them, as were the wraith-like figures that lingered to the rear. You're still awake, it would seem, the figure said. But you're... Omne began through chattering teeth. Madam Mayor, said Rai. Patrick. Dee got off his horse in the courtyard. A crisp incandescence filled the ruined garden this evening. Moonlight. He looked at the window. A human figure melted into the fleeting lamplight. Dee entered the mansion. As he walked down the ancient corridor, he seemed terribly well suited to the mansion by night. More than anyone else, this young man was a perfect match for decay. The door to the room was open. The beautiful figure that sat by the window turned to face Dee. A little late, aren't you? Price said mockingly. What are you doing? I'm waiting. For the singer, that is. I, too, grasped the beauty of the night. Once the youthful warrior had confirmed that Dee had his eyes shut, his expression became one of amazement. And are you going to become a descendant of the night? Asked the hunter. Why would you ask that? You know something after all, don't you? Once again I ask you the same question. Why have you come here, Dee? But that's not something for the singer to decide, Dee continued in a leaden voice. Well, who shall decide then? The will of the night, the one who created both the singer and the song. And that would be... Bryce began to ask as he left his palace by the window without a sound. His eyes were giving off a red glow. The seat by the window was reserved for the singer. Bryce was dumbstruck as he gazed at the woman in the gossamer gown. Particles of light glistened in the folds of her dress. "I've heard your song," Bryce said in an absent-minded tone, "and that's why I've come here. I finally realized that I was summoned. But there is no need for only one of you. But there is need for only one of you," a voice chimed in his head. The voice of a lady. A voice so beautiful it would be impossible to judge what kind of woman she was. Then that would be me. There is one more. And he will surely come here as well. So who gets to decide? The will of the night. Bryce looked at Dee. The man who'd given the exact same reply as the phantasmal singer had solidified into a statue, hued like the very darkness. "Who are you?" he asked. "What are you supposed to be?" His answer came quickly. "I'm a vampire hunter." But Dee's next words were directed at the illusion. "There's more than one of you." "Is there?" The voice in his head fell silent, and the figure by the window moved as if to display how shaken she was. "Perhaps you are correct, but who would know that there's more than one of me? That's something about which I am myself. I'm not certain." "When will the other one be here?" "Soon." On hearing the reply, Bryce turned to Dee with a terrible light in his eyes. "When that time comes, you'll only be in the way." It was a challenge. "I believe I'll get rid of you now. However, doing it in here would be too unseemly. Let's make it in the garden." Under the pale moon, the two of them squared off on a path paved with marble. A stand of trees was singing the music of the night and the wind. Which of them would have the advantage here? Dee was blind, Bryce was unarmed. However, the warrior's evil eyes would no longer serve him against the hunter, and it didn't seem likely he could defend himself from the swordplay of even a sightless Dee. "Have at you," Bryce said as he dashed to the right. His broadsword went undrawn as his finger raced across the surface of the remote control he held in his hand. The marble blocks beneath Dee's feet flipped over. Pushed up by flames, the stones were swallowed by the sky. 5 gates of fire went up. He didn't think that would be enough to slay Dee. From the cover of the decrepit fountain, Bryce surveyed his surroundings. The entire garden had been strung with wire finer than a spider's thread, and if a certain amount of pressure was put on any of those lines, it would unleash a deadly attack. The 5 crossbows he'd rigged sent iron arrows off to the right. When Price realized all of his missiles had been struck down with the most mellifluous sound imaginable, he quickly scattered smoke bombs all over the grounds and held his breath. The ability to completely conceal any sign of your presence was one of the hallmarks of an excellent warrior. A black shadow suddenly coalesced right in front of him. As Price backflipped away, cold air knifed into his shoulder. Gory blade in his right hand, Dee charged forward, but the singing put a stop to it. The song came from the same warrior who had deep red blood spilling from the shoulder he clenched. It was impossible to ignore the nobility's nocturne. In a split second, a wide blade pierced the chest of the spellbound D. Without a backward glance at the reeling hunter, Price raced toward the mansion. He'd noticed the hoofbeats of cyborg horses that had entered the garden. The other one. The instant he passed D, a hoarse voice from the vicinity of the hunter's left hand said, "Oh, you're a tricky one, all right." But the warrior had no time to take pause as he headed toward the new arrival. Second part and third part. Briar climbed down from the carriage. The vehicle he'd taken from the mayor's house was pulled by a team of 6. Its rightful owner, Omne, and the inhabitants of the subterranean chamber were standing around it as well. Price raced over to them. Glaring at Rye, he said, "You or me? Which one of us do you choose?" "It is not we that choose," the mayor told him. "The one who arranged all of this set his plans in motion more than 10,000 years ago. I finally realized just yesterday. Listen to the girl." Beside the mayor, a girl with black hair let a nocturnal grin rise on her lips. It was the daughter that had been lured away 20 years earlier. You see, when the mayor's daughter came back, she concealed the girl in that underground chamber. The basement of her own house is actually connected to the area below the concert hall. Her daughter and the other people lured by the song connected the two. Omne said as if beseeching the warrior. This was the truth that could no longer go unsaid. And all these people lived on, without ever drinking blood, merely singing that song for all eternity. The reason I was allowed to return was so that I could announce the chosen one and make the necessary preparations for this evening, the mayor's daughter said coolly. From the way she looked at him, Price knew he'd lost. So it's already been decided, then? The warrior asked. It was an empty question. Yes, and it's not you. What'll become of him? Price asked, tossing his jaw in Rye's direction. He'll become an excellent singer, I suppose. That is the result of the experiments conducted at one time by the Great One beneath the mansion. He'll live forever without drinking blood. But he hasn't been completely changed yet. Then you mean he's still not a noble? The nobility have already perished. Now it is the human era. However, that is not to say it will always be so. Why? Why choose him? Because he came here without ever hearing the song directly, and that was the very purpose of the song. There are other reasons I could give you, but there's little point in it. But, what if? Price began, his voice dipping horribly low. Fresh blood continued to spill from his shoulder. What if he were to die? The mayor's daughter said, throwing a sidelong glance at Rye. In that case, it would probably be you. At that instant, Rye covered his eyes. With the deadly glow still emanating from his pupils, Price launched himself at the boy's chest. Drawing a dagger, he stabbed the boy in a single motion. Omne let out a scream. Rye staggered around in agony. Leaving his dagger buried in Rye's chest, Price smiled and said, Dee died the same way. You can follow after him, while I stay here, forever. The warrior's body and voice convulsed in unison, slowly lowering his eyes. Price gazed down at the naked blade that had spouted from his chest. Dee, Brian mumbled as he got up again, and no sooner was the hunter on his feet than red blood spilled from the mouth of the handsome warrior. The blade had been pulled out of Price. Turning just his neck so he could sneer at the gorgeous young man in black, Preston returned his gaze to Rye and groaned. You two. Both of you, with your green, open eyes. And run right through the heart. So that's how it goes. I guess the song really wasn't for me, was it? The warrior's last breath escaped him after he'd fallen to the ground. An aura far more ghastly than Rye had once felt from Price issued from the people of the night. If they don't drink human blood, I wouldn't call them nobility, Dee said, staring at the mayor's daughter. Go on singing the song of the night. Leave the mayor and the other two children here, and the rest of you may go wherever you like. But we've been waiting so very, very long, the mayor's daughter said in a distant tone. For me it's been 20 years, but for the great one. A peculiar scent spread through the room. A bit of red stained Omne's arm. As she struggled with all her strength to win her freedom, she'd been clawed by fingernails in the process. Dee! Omne cried. The mayor's daughter opened her mouth and revealed a pair of fangs. It was the basement of the concert hall all over again. Apparently they'd only been able to get past the scent of Price's blood. But when all of them charged toward Omne, each was pierced through the chest, either by a wooden stake or naked steel. The mayor's daughter fell to the floor, and in a matter of seconds she turned to dust. Like the fine powder that shrouded the history of this house, her remains shimmered in the moonlight. Only Rye remained. I haven't spreaded fangs yet, but who can say what'll happen next? He said. I'd probably be better off just having you run me through right now. Stop it, Omne shouted, as she jumped between him and the hunter. The mayor and I will keep watch and see what happens next. If he winds up like the nobility, well, then we'll... Omne hiccuped. She said they hadn't done the last part to him yet, right? Said the mayor. Apparently freed now of her daughter's power, she shook her head as she spoke. That being the case, I suppose there's a chance he might go back to being a normal human being. However, and there she broke off. I really don't know, she continued, even though I talked with my daughter so many times about humans and nobles, there is no way to be certain. Which do you suppose is better? What are you going to do, Dee? His only answer was silence. Showered with moonlight, the four figures simply stood there, like philosophers, waiting for an answer that would never come. Page break indicated by a small cross. Several minutes later, Dee got across the courtyard and exited the mansion. Straddling his horse, he turned back to the building once before riding off. Silhouettes flickered in the lit window. Were there two, or were there three? Quickly facing forward again, Dee gave a kick to his mount's flanks. Shortly after the Black Rider was swallowed by the darkness, a gentle voice began to drift out into the night from somewhere. There was no saying whether it was that of a man or a woman, but it sang the nocturne. Dark Nocturne. End.